Past few weeks, having done several lessons on the subject of disciples, more than I originally intended to do. Before I moved on from that, I could hardly really leave the subject of disciples without giving some thought to what Jesus said about disciples in Matthew chapter 28, verses 18 through 20. We're going to consider some statements from this both this morning and this evening. So let's begin by reading this brief section, Matthew chapter 28. Read with me verses 18 through 20. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John all give us some portion of the things that Jesus said during that final few weeks that he spent with his disciples after his resurrection. And while many of them say similar things, several of them are actually said at different occasions and at different times. So in Matthew 28, Jesus is with the disciples in Galilee. He told them to go there after he appeared to them in Jerusalem. He told them to go to Galilee and he would meet them there. And it's there, you can notice in verse 16, that Jesus says these things to them. Jesus came and spoke to them, saying, "All authority has been given to me in heaven and on earth. Go therefore and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you. And lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age." And then Matthew adds to what Jesus said there, amen. Of course, Matthew was there and heard these words and then preserves them for us. First, I want us to consider out of this paragraph, what does Jesus say that applies to us? Is it all of it? Some of it? Because there are some things that Jesus says to the apostles on some occasions that apply only to them. For example, in Matthew chapter 10 and verse 19, I've always thought if I could have any of the miracles that the apostles did, this would be the one that I would want. Where Jesus told them that you don't have to prepare, you don't need to take notes with you, that the hour in which you speak, it will be given to you what to say. Definitely don't have that spiritual miraculous gift for certain. So what was said there was unique to the work of the apostles. That was not a promise that Jesus was making to all of his disciples, all of his people, even all of his people at that time. In John chapter 16, several things that Jesus says regarding the Holy Spirit were unique to the work that the apostles were going to do. And then in Mark chapter 16, verse 20, where Jesus said that those who believe will heal the sick and raise the dead, and if they drink any poison, it will not harm them. Well, that was said to the apostles, and that was unique to the apostles. Maybe it could include those who would be given some of those miraculous gifts, but when Jesus spoke of those who would believe, he was trying to build them up because of the problem of their own unbelief. So there are definitely times where what Jesus says to the apostles applied only to the apostles. But would that be true about what we just read in Matthew chapter 28? Some of the things that Jesus says, for example, go and make disciples. Is there anything that was unique to the apostles so that the work of making disciples could only happen if you had an apostle there? Were apostles only? Were the apostles the only ones who were giving the work of making disciples? That answer is clearly no, from a very general reading even of the book of Acts. Also, Jesus says, "I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." Well, the end of the age or the end of the world, depending on your translation there, the apostles didn't make it out of the first century. And so the end of the world still continues. The end of the age has not happened yet. And so that would also tell us that the things that Jesus says to the apostles have an application beyond the apostles alone. And so they do have application for us today. And so we're especially going to be thinking about the applications for us of these instructions regarding making disciples. But before he says that in verse 19, what Jesus says, of course, in verse 18 is the foundation upon which there can be disciples. Why is Jesus telling the apostles what to do? Why do they listen? And why would we give time to something that was said 2,000 years ago? Well, it's because all authority, Jesus reminds them, had been given to him. So even though in this part, Jesus, he could have said, I am the rabbi, I am the teacher, and therefore go make disciples. He could have taught it that way, but he just worded it a different way. What he begins with is reminding them that he has all authority. And so why did they need to submit themselves to Jesus? And why do we need to do that? The way that Jesus begins here is, as parents often say, well, because I said so. And sometimes parents might give other reasons and a variety of motivations, both positive and negative. And Jesus does some of that in Mark chapter 16 and verse 16. But here he just basically says, because of who I am, because I have authority, you don't need any other explanation for why to do it. That's all you need to know. Now go, and then we'll talk more about what he said to do. Now it's true, as the apostles had spent time already with Jesus, and then in the things they had already heard him say and seen him do, they would continue to grow even in their own understanding of the reasons why they ought to do what he said to do. And if we mature in our faith, then we certainly grow in our reasons in addition to his authority, the benefits, the blessings, the things that we receive, the things that we're protected from. All of these things motivate us to do whatever he has said to do. But probably all of us, spiritually, also like physical little children, the first reason that we learn to do what he has said to do is for this reason, because of who he is, and therefore that's what we need to do. This is an important foundation to understand. All authority belongs to Jesus in heaven and on earth. And so in all of the activities of man in particular, Jesus has all authority. And that's a concept, that's a statement and a concept that we have to keep in our mind because of the many enemies to his authority. Think about what were the enemies to his authority at the time that he said this. Of course, the Pharisees, they challenged his authority constantly, even asking him once, well, who gave you authority? And he had tried to tell them, and they didn't bother to listen or to try to understand. And the rich young ruler came to Jesus, recognizing Jesus' authority, but there was an enemy of Jesus' authority in the heart of the rich young ruler. And in other examples that you could think of. And so there were, and there still are today, enemies of the authority of Jesus. And so we, though maybe familiar, or maybe still learning this statement and its application, need to go back to it time and time again, that Jesus has all authority. The enemies of that authority in Jesus' day we can learn about, but we've got to be able to make the transition to be able to recognize, well, what are the enemies of Jesus' authority today? They may have a different label, may be called by a different word, but they're still similar as there were then, so there are today religious leaders who, by maybe not in word, but by their teachings and by their claims, challenge the authority of Jesus in ways that are similar to the way that the Pharisees did. And so, while it's still true to some degree, maybe in our society as a whole, in the past, some of the most visible enemies of Jesus' authority were people who would say, well, the Pope, he has all authority because he's the personal representative of Jesus. That's an enemy of his authority. And then whenever man-made writings, whether they're called a creed or called something else, when they are given devotion and attention equal to or above what the Bible teaches, well then that's an enemy of Jesus' authority. And when man promotes himself, whether it's with an official title of some kind, to be a president over some religious group or leader in some way, or whether it's someone like Diotrephes in 3 John. He wasn't having anyone call him Holy Father, but he loved to have the preeminence, and he expected it, and he demanded it to the point that caused division in the church. So regardless of the level, those are enemies of the authority of Jesus that have been prevalent and powerful in our society, and those are not going away. But maybe as opposed to 50 or 100 years ago, it isn't that Satan is switching tactics. Those ideas still continue, but then just the number of attempts that Satan makes to oppose the authority of Christ continues to grow. For a variety of reasons in our society, there's the attack on his authority by the absolute, complete denial of it. And so, you just can't really be confident or sure that the Bible is from God. Well, what's that? That's an attack on Jesus' authority. Therefore, we can't know the truth. We can't really know if there was someone that ever lived that was named Jesus, as the Bible represents it. And we can't really know if we have an accurate record of what he said or who he was. And so that's continues to gain momentum in our society. And so then you have from there the denial that the human spirit, that humans are really significantly of a distinct kind or different from an animal. And that's an absolute denial of Jesus' authority. And then that leads to a denial of eternity. And so our society struggles in a variety of ways, or denies, tangles with the authority of Jesus in these ways. There's always, in every age, has been the cultural pressure to conform, to be more like, to do things like everybody else does because you're a member of that nation. The pressure to conform to sin, or at least to tolerate it, not to view it as being inferior to any other way of life. That pressure continues to grow. And then in Matthew 13 and verse 22, when Jesus spoke about the thorny ground, the soil that the heart that heard what Jesus has said, but then desires the ease and comfort and just relaxing and just taking it easy and not taking everything so seriously, the pleasures of this life, the cares of this world, when those gain more attention, well, what that really results in is just a neglect of the subject of authority. The thorny soil could be someone who reads this passage and sings it, praise him because he has all authority, but doesn't dwell on that enough to live under his authority from day to day. So the foundation of what Jesus says that we're giving most attention to is upon this, that Jesus has all authority. And so if they understood that, and we understand that, then we can build upon that, and based upon that he says, "Go therefore." Now, I want to mainly focus on that. Go therefore, and he describes all nations, and on a different occasion, in Mark chapter 16, though Jesus' basic teachings are similar, on another occasion he said it a different way, go into all the world. In Luke chapter 24 and verse 47, he says that repentance and remission of sins should be preached to all nations. So on different times, just as we know with the apostles, as Jesus was training them, the first time Jesus said it, they didn't always catch it, because they were just like you and just like me. And so several times Jesus emphasizes to them that where I'm sending you to is everywhere. Contrast that with what we know about the Old Covenant. God didn't send Israel when he brought them out of Egypt. He didn't say, go into all the world, go live among every creature. No, he sent them to a very narrowly defined place with a very specific boundary. And we know what he sent them into Canaan to do in the days of Joshua. Joshua was the conqueror. You can read about that in the book of Joshua. He sent them into Canaan to destroy the nations. But notice how this is a new plan and a new covenant. And it's the exact opposite of that. It's not go into this land and stay there and destroy them. It's a new covenant. It's go into all the world, go into every nation. And in the next verse, we'll see, or the next statement, we'll see what they were to do there, though I think you already know. But he tells them to go to all nations, to every creature. Even though in some ways it's simple and obvious, I want to spend a few minutes thinking about what he was telling them to do and what he was requiring of them, and then we'll talk about the application to that. But when he says, go to all nations, was it possible for Peter? Was he telling Peter, you've got to go, Peter, to every nation? Peter, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Peter, you've got to go to every creature. Is that what Jesus meant? He said, go, all nations, every creature. Let me give this parallel. What God told Adam and Eve in the beginning, he was in some ways going to send them out. He told them, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. Well, could Adam and Eve fill the earth? Just them two alone? Well, no. There was a work that began with Adam and Eve, and that work outlived them, even though they lived, at least we know Adam lived several hundred years. That work outlived them. They had a part to do. They had a part in the work of filling the earth, but that responsibility outlived them, and that work outlived them. So, likewise, of course, no single apostle could go to every place. Peter was not assigned, well, you go to every creature, and then after he goes to every creature, Simon, you follow up every person he talks to, and you talk to each one of them, and then Matthew, you're the next one in line. That is obviously not what Jesus was saying. That was not possible for them. They were as limited in most ways as you and I are. But each one of them had something to do in the work of going to every nation, of going to every creature, and each one of them was responsible to do everything that they possibly could to the accomplishment of this. And some of the apostles lived longer. From what we can tell, it appears that John lived the longest and the latest. And so they each had different abilities, and they were simply all to do what they could in this work. Think of another part of the emphasis of Jesus when he says go to all nations. You remember there was another occasion where Jesus sent them out, but he didn't send them to all nations. Sometimes people call it the limited commission, the instruction to go out, but he limited them to only go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel. So that was an assignment they had been given in the past. But that's in contrast to this. There's no borders that would limit where they would go. They were to go to all places. For the apostles, this was also important because what was the mindset of a Jew in regards to geography, in regards to place? We have a patriotic song, this land is your land, it's my land, this land was made for you and me. Kind of in a sense, we know what that means. But the Jews would sing that sort of in a different way, right? This land is our land. This land was made for us because of the promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The Jews were not that they didn't ever go and live in other places, but they always came back home 3 times a year. And if you were going to serve the God of heaven, they would let some of the other nations serve the God of heaven. But within your ability, where did you have to go if you were going to serve the true and the living God? You had to go to this land. You had to go to Jerusalem. You had to go to the temple. And so that was the Jewish mindset, of course, for generations and generations. And even for these disciples, for decades, that's what they had grown up in. That was the mindset, because the temple was in Jerusalem. And so, just as we know there were other ideas the apostles had that needed to be weeded out and unwound and sometimes completely removed, this is unwinding the Jewish mindset that this is the land, this is the place. We might go out, but when we go out, we've got to bring everybody here, at least on some occasions. That mindset was being changed. And that temporary mission to only go to the lost sheep of Israel was being changed. So what he's telling them in part is, do not stay here. Go to all nations. And when you go, they will understand later, you're never going to send them back here. And when you go, you're not just going to the Jews. You're going to all nations, to every creature. So that's what he expected of them. Though he said, go to all nations, Peter didn't have to have his passport book stamped by every nation before he died in order to submit himself to these instructions. And so that helps us to understand, because this has application to you and to me. So what does God expect of you? You know, even if the apostles could teach, have gone personally to every creature, well then would the work of Matthew 28, with these words of Jesus, would that work be over? Well, that was 2,000 years ago. Everybody that was on earth then has died. And so because there's still the need for disciples and the authority of Jesus to be known and submitted to, then this work still continues. So that means you and I are faced with the same instruction. Jesus says to you and to me, go to all nations, go to every creature. So what does he mean? What does he require of you and of me by that? At first, if we don't give this at least a little bit of thought, then we might think, well, I know I can't do that, so I guess I just need to pray for people who can do that. I'll pray for people who can move across the world to go and to preach to all nations and every creature. Well, that's good to pray for people who might travel thousands of miles to do that work. But are you saying that there's someone you can pray for and that person can go to all nations and that person can go to every creature? There's nobody today that can do that any more than the apostles did. So pray for others who do travel a long way, but that doesn't satisfy what Jesus says here that has application to each one of us. In fact, this is not mainly a verse, though the apostles had some unique responsibilities. Matthew 28, 18 through 20 is not a verse that's mainly for preachers or for evangelists. I think you know that already, because verse 18 is not mainly for preachers or evangelists. And if you look at the end of verse 20, I'm with you always, that's not mainly for evangelists or preachers, is it? So this has application to all of us, all nations, every creature. He says to all of us, we need to go. So what does that mean? Does that mean, well, all those Christians in the Philippines, they need to leave the Philippines and they need to come to America? And all the Christians in America, we need to move to the Philippines or some other country. We just need to all swap spots. Well, if we did that, what would it accomplish? Take a lot of resources and nothing different would be done. So we have a duty here. What was expected of them helps us to understand what is expected to us. Jesus says to go, and no, one individual can't go everywhere. But every person who lives on this earth goes somewhere. And everyone who is a disciple of Jesus Christ goes somewhere. And that's the responsibility. When he says go to all nations, we often, when we think of a nation, then we think of this boundary. And so we can draw on a line, we can draw with a line the boundary of the U.S. and Canada and Mexico. We can draw a boundary of all of that. But is Jesus saying, well, you've got to cross at least two boundaries in your lifetime? You've got to cross that marker. Is that what Jesus' point is? Everybody who is my disciple, you can't die in the same place that you were born. You've got to cross at least one boundary so that you're in nations. Well, geography is not the focus of this, other than it's not just here, not just in Israel for them. What does he want them to be in different nations for? Not a sightseeing tour, because there's people in all nations, right? And so that is his focus. Go to the people go out, wherever the boundary is marked, doesn't matter, go to the people. That's the application for you and me, to go to the people that you can go to. The apostles could only go to each individual apostle could only go to a certain, very small percentage of the population of all the earth. But each one of them had the duty to go to whomever they had the opportunity to go to. And that's what we can do. And sometimes we might go because that's our plan. We're going specifically in order to try to talk to others and try to teach others, like we get a fair or a booth at the local fair or some other effort where we're going. And that's the primary thing. There might be other side conversations, and we might see someone we know, oh, hey, and chit-chat. But that's kind of secondary. That's very secondary to why we're there. Sometimes we go with the main purpose of talking about these things. But we all do other kinds of going. Turn to Acts chapter 8. I'm not using as many different passages this morning, just because we're mainly just thinking about this one. But look in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. Here are some people who went out. They were going, but they were not mainly going because they heard what Jesus said about go and make disciples. Read with me Acts 8 verse 4 and answer the question, why were these people going? Therefore those who were scattered went everywhere preaching the word. Now, if we just read part of that, we might think, oh, well, here, they're going into all the world preaching the gospel to every creature because Jesus said to. But why were they scattered? Well, they were going because if they didn't go, if they stayed where they were, Saul of Tarsus was going to find them, have them thrown into prison, press them to deny their faith, and even have their life ended. So they weren't specifically going in response to, well, Jesus said to go, so we're going to go. They went, but for a different reason. Wasn't wrong. My point is, we go out for different reasons. And these people, they were going out in order to preserve their life. But when they went, even though they were just escaping persecution, when they went out, what did they do? They went everywhere preaching the word. This is talking about both men and women. When you look at the end of verse 3, they went everywhere, which is pretty impressive, because when they preached the word in Jerusalem, their lives were in danger, and so they went everywhere else, and they did the same thing that got them in trouble last time, but they went out and they didn't stop. They went everywhere preaching the word. So we do lots of going, all of us, and we can go a little faster and a little bit farther and a little more comfortably than many people, at least in this part of the country, in the past. So be sure we understand and take personally what Jesus said and what he meant. He is not saying that we have to do something we cannot do. And this is not something that is exclusively, completely accomplished by any individual. But when you go, whether you're going specifically to talk and to teach, or whether you're going into the community on a regular basis, when you go, you are going into the world. Not into all of the world at every step, but when you go out, you're going out into the world. When you go across the street, you're going to one of the creatures. Jesus said, go preach the gospel to every creature. Well, there's a creature across the street and next door. And when you go near or far for business or for pleasure or whatever your reason is for going, you're going to meet people of a variety of nations. You're going to meet people of different parts of this world, regardless of what their citizenship would be. And so, are you willing to go because Jesus has all authority? Even if your going is to familiar places, even if your going is to familiar people, are you willing to go? That's what he was telling them to do. And that's what he's telling us to do, is to go. And when you go because he has all authority, And when you go, Jesus says, go and make disciples. Make disciples of all the nations. Remember, disciples are people who desire to be trained. They signed up for it. Somebody else can't sign them up to be a disciple. Nobody can sign you up to be a disciple. A disciple is someone who has been convinced and persuaded and desire to be trained and to understand the words of the teacher, and then that's for the purpose of imitating the teacher. And so these who were disciples, he says, you go out and make disciples. There may be, depending on your translation, this may be worded differently in this part of the verse, but these two words, make disciples, are a translation of one word. And I don't need to get into because I'm not trained in the Greek language, but this word is a verb, you remember, an action word. What he tells them to do is go and do something, go and make disciples. Because a disciple, as I've said in other lessons, is not just who you are, but being a disciple then tells you what you do. For example, what does a cook do? Well, a cook cooks. What does a runner do? A runner runs. A talker talks. A listener listens. A disciple disciples. We don't usually use the word disciple as a verb of an action. It's usually of a noun, of a person. But if you think of it in that way, we have lots of words that the verb just describes the noun. The cook cooks. Well, the disciple disciples. You could make disciples. You could just take that and make that one word. Go into all the world and disciple. Disciple all nations. That's what he's telling them to do. Now, not, of course, don't make them disciples of yourself. You're not the rabbi. You're not the teacher. Jesus is. But you go and convince others that they ought to desire to be trained and understand and to imitate the teacher. And what are the ways of doing that? How do I disciple others? Well, I've heard of a variety of ways. I heard of someone who was pulled over for a routine traffic violation, minor as I recall, and they were going to a gospel meeting. And at the conclusion, they weren't doing this to try to look holy and get out of the ticket. But at the end of after the traffic cop stopped, the person said, well, I'm on the way to a gospel meeting, and gave them a flyer and left. And eventually that police officer became a Christian. Here was not someone who made that plan. Well, let me see, how am I going to invite someone to come tonight? I'll get a ticket, and then that'll be the way you can get a police officer's attention that way. But here was someone who was going, not for this specific reason, but as they went, that was something that they were thinking of. Know someone else that they just went to the mall to have an indoor place to walk and to exercise. And in the course of that, there were other people walking, and there was conversation, and so there was someone discipling others. I know someone, so do you, who was given cassette tapes from a neighbor or from a family friend, and that person listened to those tapes. My point is, normal activities and routine interactions provide each of us on a regular basis opportunities to do what Jesus is talking about, to disciple. Now, we can't all do the same thing for all of the same people, just like neither could the apostles. But just because Peter maybe couldn't meet all of the same people that John could meet didn't mean he shouldn't do anything. It just meant Peter needed to do what Peter could do with what God had given him. And Matthew needed to do, and John needed to do, and you and I need to do what we can with the people that we meet. Turn to Acts chapter 14. Acts chapter 14 and verse 21. Acts 14 verse 21 is really a reflection of what we've already read. But notice, when they had preached the gospel to that city and made many disciples, then they went on and they traveled and actually went back to see some other brethren. But how do you disciple others? Well, by preaching the gospel. And somehow, I don't know exactly why, but preaching in our society, that English word preach, usually we get the picture of what's happening right now. People sitting and trying to be quiet and still, and one person is talking. But you need to know the word preach doesn't have that kind of limitation to it. There may be some occasions that can reflect that, but what we read in Acts chapter 8 and in Acts chapter 14 was not something that was limited to a public assembly specifically for the purpose of worshiping. Preaching can happen there, no doubt, but preaching the gospel, back to Acts chapter 8 verse 4, happens in a variety of places, and wherever it happens, that's the work of discipling. Now, that word discipling, I don't know if that rung a bell or threw up a red flag for you. It's been abused at times where people have said, well, I'm discipling, and there's a group called the International Churches of Christ, and for a time, that was really a word that they were known by, that they had a discipler. And what they meant by that was, when there was a new Christian, the church assigned someone to that new Christian and said, here is your discipler. They are going to disciple you. And they had a very strict schedule. You've got to pray with them. You've got to confess your sins to this individual. And so there are some people, especially maybe not familiar with the Bible, and that was what they had heard about discipling. And it was something far beyond what Jesus meant by that. But so that's not what Jesus meant, but if we can just simply grasp what he did mean. This work in Acts 14 reflects what we read in Acts chapter 8 and verse 4. That there were men and women in Jerusalem, and they were scattered, and they went everywhere preaching the word. They went everywhere making disciples. And it's the authority of Jesus that equips us. Well, how do I make disciples? And it's true, the Bible doesn't give a three-step process. Here are the three things you do, and if you'll do these three things, then that'll guarantee that there will be other disciples. Not written that way, but when we think about, if we end at the beginning, Jesus says, all authority has been given to me. Well, because he has all authority, then we have something to do wherever we go. Whatever our reason for running out or going out, we have something to do because we're not going out just for ourselves if we're a disciple. If we're going to the store to get food for our family, we're doing that because all authority has been given to Jesus in heaven and on earth, and he's given you some role in your family. So literally everything we do every day ought to be because he has authority. But also everywhere we go, we have something to do. Is there an opportunity to contribute something to the process of making disciples? Jesus goes on to say, make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit. And so Jesus is the one who decided that water baptism would be one among several essential parts of being a disciple. And again, on another occasion, though Jesus didn't use the word disciple in Mark chapter 16, he was reinforcing and continuing to train and to teach them in the work of making disciples when he said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved. And then last, once I become a disciple, his work continues to equip me. Well, how do I make others a disciple? Well, if I am a disciple, I know how to be a disciple. I've made it that far. So how do I make others a disciple? And each of us can think back to someone who helped me to learn why I needed to be a disciple. Well, what did they do? What did they do to help you? Was it a parent? Was it a spouse? Was it a friend? Was it a neighbor? I don't know. Start with that. What did someone else do to help you to be a disciple? And then from there, you learn your own talents, and gifts, and abilities, and opportunities that we use in a variety of ways, and we need to use those for the benefit of others. What Jesus said reminds us that if I'm a disciple, I need to be taught. Because you teach them, make disciples, teaching them to observe or to keep or to obey whatever things I have commanded you. So that means if I'm a disciple, then other disciples need to be doing that to me. And I need to be doing that to others as well. And though the word local church isn't specified here in Matthew 28, that is definitely a part of what Jesus is describing there when he says, teaching them to keep or obey all things whatsoever I have commanded you. In Ephesians chapter 4, verses 11 through 16, Paul writes about apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And pastors would specifically have a reference to the local church, the people whom they oversee. And all of those workers are working together with all of the saints. And you remember verse 16, that as every part does its share, that causes the growth of the body for the edifying of itself in love. Ephesians chapter 4, 11 through 16 is in some ways a commentary on Matthew chapter 28 and verse 20. Because Jesus has all authority, then disciples need to teach and admonish, encourage, and help other disciples. You need to give that, and you need to receive that. And that can, of course, happen between us and Christians who live 100 or 1,000 miles away. We can write a letter, we can make a phone call, we can send a text message to encourage them, of course. Not limited to the local church. But by nature of our human limitations, of course, the local church is the primary, the most common and accessible part of God's plan for disciples to work together in the process of ongoing teaching. And so Jesus said, "Go therefore and make disciples." We didn't finish the verse, and so I'll continue in this study tonight. But you are a disciple in part because someone else was a disciple, and someone else recognized their responsibility. Someone else couldn't teach everybody in all the world, but they recognized in some way their opportunity to teach you and helped you to be a disciple. Are you doing the work of a disciple? Well, actually the first question is, are you a disciple? And Jesus taught who a disciple is. It's he that believes and is baptized. Those whose sins are forgiven are disciples. But if you are a disciple, if you're not a disciple, be a disciple. If you're a disciple, then be a disciple. Let's do the work. And if as a disciple you've returned to your sin, then be a disciple and return to your master, confess your sin to him. If you have been, then be his disciple, abide in his word, and that will strengthen us. And what we'll look at tonight will relate to his promise to help us in the work of being disciples for the rest of our lives. But turn your songbooks to number 488. The rest of our lives begin in part with our decisions today. If we can help you in being a disciple in any way, come forward and tell us how we could as we stand and sing.